Okay, so we are a few minutes after 6:30, so I'll go ahead and lead us in. Good evening, everyone, and thanks to all for joining this evening. I'm Rendell Bustos. I am a senior planner in the city's planning division, which is under the community development department. So this is a community workshop that's centered around some upcoming amendments to our security code. And the amendments will cover a variety of topics, mainly relating to development projects. So your input this evening is a key step in the code amendment process, so we appreciate you joining. I do want to note that this meeting is being recorded, mainly so we have something to refer back to make sure everyone's input was captured. So starting with a brief overview of tonight's presentation, we'll start with some introductions from the city team. And we'll also provide an overview of this effort and move on to going over each individual topic area. And lastly, we'll cover some discussion questions to prompt you to give us some feedback on these specific topic areas. And so the goal of tonight's workshop is to obtain your feedback, update you on the process as we develop the code amendment. So we look forward to hearing from you. So to introduce the city team, again, my name is Rendell Bustos, a senior planner in the city's planning division. So one of my main focus areas is processing development applications for new buildings, mixed-use buildings, commercial buildings, as well as additions. And that obviously involves coordination with several different city departments, including the police department. So I'll go ahead and pass it to Brendan to give an intro to himself.
Good evening. My name is Brendan Bartholomew. I'm a sergeant here with the police department. My role and why I'm here with you tonight is I also do the plan reviews for planning applications and building permits for the city for crime prevention through environmental design purposes.
Thanks, Brendan. And I also want to note that we have Mary Way from our admin team helping facilitate and run the meeting. So if you hear me calling Mary to facilitate, don't be surprised. So moving now to an overview of this effort, I wanted to start by covering sort of where these amendments would apply. So these amendments apply citywide because it is amendments to our code, and that's under chapter 23.53. So that's an existing code section. So the amendments would apply again citywide and particularly to new and altered projects, mainly for development projects. And those projects specifically would include multifamily projects, commercial projects, as well as mixed use projects. So those that combine mixed use, commercial and multifamily uses. A key point that we wanted to make is that these requirements would not apply retroactively to projects that already exist or are occupied or constructed. So these, again, would not be subject to those projects, but if they were to alter later on, these amendments would apply. A little bit on the purpose of the amendments. So the amendments are, of course, to update our security standards as developers and architects are designing their projects. And it would also codify practices that exist currently that we've implemented typically through conditions of approval. And as we're looking into amendments, we're keeping in mind that we don't want to create barriers that help facilitate project approvals, particularly for housing, which we know is a key issue that the state faces. And to that end, we wanted to move away from overly prescriptive language and have code language be driven by intent rather than be overly prescribed. So briefly on the timeline, so the police and planning division, we began this effort in roughly April timeframe and started to draft the amendments for internal review. So here we are currently highlighted in orange at tonight's workshop to, again, obtain your feedback. From here, after tonight's workshop, we'll take your feedback, and as we finalize amendments, we'll incorporate them and consider them and move on to finalizing the amendments and move on to a public hearing in front of the city council in July, specifically the July 17th meeting. So with that overview, I'll pass it along to Brendan to go over each amendment in more detail.
Thanks, Randall. So in general, we're going to talk about four main areas. The first one will be about parking garages and parking garage security. Then video surveillance, emergency access for the police department, and then there's 3 or 4 minor edits to text in the city's municipal code that we're going to be looking at. So the current state of parking garages, it separates, the current code requires that residential parking be secured from all other uses. So it requires a gate that separates from visitor parking. It also would separate from commercial parking. The gate location in the current code requires that part of a garage be open to visitors at all times. And it does not address anything about video surveillance in the municipal code itself. So some of the hurdles we've come up with projects in the past is it may require multiple gates, particularly in mixed use garages. The current state of the municipal code prevents the mixed or shared use of parking throughout the entire garage. And it does not address well the use of mixed use garages. So our proposed amendment here is to try and clarify the scope. What we're talking about is putting in the language that's only applied to units that are 5 or more that have shared garages. We're going to require only a single gate, and that gate could be at the very front of the garage. And in addition to the gate, we're going to talk about adding a video surveillance system and lighting for the purposes of security. Some things that are already addressed and that will be retained in the code are emergency access for the police into the garage, some additional screening materials around openings that are not meant for vehicle or pedestrian access. And we're hoping what this does is it will not require multiple gates. So it'll allow projects to design what they think is best for their own project with our input and review. It'll allow flexible use of the full garage, particularly in mixed use settings. And it'll start addressing mixed use projects. Moving on to video surveillance in general. So this would not be for garages, but in general. There's nothing specific in the code, in the municipal code, that addresses that. In the past, staff has been relying on a section that relies on the additional measures. So it's kind of a general authority we've been using. And the problem with this is we've run into some concerns from project teams that come into the city that are not used to our practices and haven't been through a project before, where there's a perceived lack of transparency about what the police department's going to ask for to ensure that there's a secure building. So what we're looking to do is we're going to add a section to the building security code that'll ask for the installation and maintenance of recorded video surveillance systems. There's nothing about having to have somebody live monitor the system. The video that we ask for is going to be covering publicly accessible grounds to the property. And what we're hoping to accomplish by this is codifying our intent and the past practice for at least the past 5 years, where we've been asking for video surveillance and conditions of approval for projects, and being transparent with our requirements for project teams coming into the city. When we talk about accessible grounds, it's the publicly accessible one, so where somebody could walk to from off the sidewalk into a project. And we're hoping that what this does is this will provide some flexibility for particularly small projects. We're going to do a small alteration or addition to know what we're asking for, so they can go through their building permits without any undue burden. It's important that we're going to note this doesn't apply to single family residences. And all it does is set the minimum requirements. Projects can go above and beyond that, and may for larger scale projects. For emergency access, again, this isn't addressing garages, this is general emergency access for the police department. There's no section that mirrors like the fire code does to provide emergency access for the fire department. And the police department doesn't have access to Knox box systems like from the fire department. So the police don't have a way to get in. So we've been using the same general authority to add additional measures through conditions of approval for projects. Again, that's caused some projects to come in and ask why we asked for multiple entry systems for their projects, and they had asked us to be a little clearer for them in the future. So the proposed amendment here is to install and maintain a police emergency access system. Codifies that intent, going to provide some transparency for projects coming in. This is something we've been asking for and obtaining for projects for over 5 years through environment or through conditions of approval. Again, it doesn't apply to single family residences. And the intent of these kind of access systems is so that the police can get to the front door of a project or property. So if an emergency is happening inside a particular apartment, we're not locked out outside of a lobby. So if a project comes in where the front doors to people's units are accessible from the outside, this wouldn't be a section that would apply to your particular project. The last one here, this is the 3 minor edits that we're looking for. Currently, the city has a requirement that massage establishments have a minimum amount of lighting inside the massage rooms. That currently is set at 40 watts, which means that you have to go to Home Depot and find an old screw-in light bulb. So projects that are coming in with a building permit don't have the ability to show compliance with that because they're primarily using LEDs. So we're going to switch to 40 watts to an equivalent amount of lumens for that. In the purpose and intent portion of the building security code in 23.54 of the municipal code talks about the intent of the code, and it talks about using crime prevention through environmental design and defensible space techniques, which are pretty close to synonymous now, the way CPTED is used. So we're going to update the defensible space techniques to the use of technology. Again, that formalizes the use of technology to reduce the demand for policing on projects. It formalizes some language we've been using in conditions of approval and CEQA documents for larger projects, identifying that we need to start leveraging technology more. And the last minor update is in the security building code is the high rises. So high rise for the building security code is defined as 55 feet. And what we found is that you could put a building in on one side of the street that's 55 feet that only has, I'm sorry, it's 5 stories currently. So you would find a building that's 55 feet, but only has floor 4 stories inside, would not be required to provide space for the city to provide our own emergency communication equipment, where next door or across the street, a building with 55 feet, but 5 stories inside would be required to provide us some space. So what's happened, we've had projects come in that are with that situation where the project teams are concerned about the lack of consistency for our needs. So we're going to update that to 55 feet to clarify the need there for the space for the radio equipment and then provide consistency throughout the project. Those are the updates we're looking for.
Perfect. Thanks, Brendan. So before moving to the discussion topics, I wanted to again put Brendan and my contact info on the screen in case you have any questions that come to mind after tonight's workshop. So here's our info again. So to prompt some discussion and hear from all of you, we've posed, these questions here. So going through them one by one. First, are there any concerns with codifying these requirements? As Brendan explained, in past projects, most of these requirements have been implemented as conditions of approval. But are there concerns with the approach to codify them? Second, are there updates that you didn't see covered here that you would like to see or would have liked to have seen as part of this amendment? And last, of course, do you have any questions? So keep in mind that these are just guiding questions, so you can feel free to comment within any subject area that you see necessary or any topic area you see necessary. And we're happy to go back to a specific slide to get clarification. So at this point, I will ask that you raise your hand to be unmuted in order to speak. We don't have a particularly large number of attendees, so I'd highly encourage folks to, share and get your thoughts out. And if you don't feel prepared, to share today, you can always contact myself or Brendan directly. So again, feel free to raise your hand. And Mary, I do see one individual with their hand raised.
Yes, it's Monique. Monique, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Just had some questions about some of the areas, not necessarily that was previously part of the conditions of approval and now are just being codified, but the other textual edits, especially around defensive space techniques. Can you explain a little bit more? Are you saying that you're replacing the defensive space techniques with technology, which seems like a step backwards? Or are you allowing technology to be a part of the defensive space techniques?
Sure. So what currently exists in the code is that it says two things. It says we should use the crime prevention through environmental design and the defensible space techniques. They're pretty much, they're the same thing. They're almost the same thing. They use some different words to describe the same concepts. So rather than have duplicate language in the municipal code, we're going to replace and update from defensible space techniques to include technology. So it's, the idea was to not have the duplicate language in there, but to show and formalize what we've been saying in CEQA documents and in conditions of approval in the past, that we need to be able to leverage technology a little bit to reduce the demand for policing and to better police when it's necessary.
Okay, because I think one of the great things about the crime prevention through environmental design techniques is that, well, there's a lot of great things. One, it doesn't put cameras or make people part of, like, it's not like a artificial policing, it creates a natural policing.
Right.
And then the second part of that that's really great about that particular concept is that it doesn't add a bunch of cost to our projects. I'm with a development, so it doesn't add a ton of cost to our project. So will you, I guess, is it pushing for us to add more technology to our projects instead of doing more natural defense designing in crime prevention versus just putting cameras up? Because putting cameras up it doesn't prevent crime, it just tells us who did it. We would like for our residents to actually have the opportunity to live in spaces that actually prevent the crime.
No, we want that too. And that's why we're retaining the crime prevention through environmental design. That's still in the code. It just wasn't one of the text languages we're updating. So that in the new version of the code, that'll remain crime prevention through environmental design. We're just removing the 3 words defensible space techniques and inserting technology to address that. There have been some studies that show that cameras do have some crime prevention effect, but also it's important that we as a police department have the ability to do an investigation if something does occur and the crime prevention through environmental design techniques aren't effective. So we've had good success with that, and we've been applying those costs to projects for over 5 years in a pretty reasoned way, and we're hoping that continues. We're just trying to speak to the intent of that.
Okay. Have y'all seen the data change as a result? Because I have seen a lot of studies done by various universities that show that like monitoring and cameras and things are not necessarily moving the dime. So I could send you some of those studies too, if that'll help with some of your work towards this.
I guess,
Is there a possibility I'm the only person in this?
we see, I was just gonna say, I see at least two other people or the other people attending. Do you have any questions you wanna raise and take the opportunity to unmute or?
I do have one more question if it's okay.
Sure.
With the city communication systems, typically, I guess what had been done in the past for many of the cities that we work in, is based on doing testing at a
Right.
certain phase of a project to determine if it's needed.
Yep.
Or is this now gonna just be a blanket kind of, if you're over 55 feet, you just need to add it to your project, or whether or not the project across the street added it already?
Yeah, so the project, yeah, the intent of this is to be more consistent throughout. And the further language of the text, we're not saying that you install radio equipment in your, all we need is a footprint and particularly the conduit and the weatherhead on the roof to install. The city will purchase and pay for the radio equipment.
Okay.
But what we found is we have had the need in the past to install radio equipment without the project or before this Muni code was in there. And what happens is then we're just bolting a piece of conduit onto your project, and nobody, particularly my friends in CDD, they don't love that. So that's the intent of this code, is that we've built in the infrastructure into your project, and it's included at the early stages in the design phase and in the construction phase, when it's less expensive for everybody involved and doesn't have the negative impacts to the aesthetics of a property or to the structure if we have to bore through floors to install equipment, if your project creates a radio shadow on the outside. So the system that's envisioned in the building security code is not going to be a replacement for the ERRC that the fire code needs. This system is designed to correct a radio shadow on the outside of your project, which can come up and give us space to fix that around you.
Thank you. That was very clear.
See, I saw one dropped away. We're down to one left. I'm calling you by name, but if there are other questions, or Monique, if you have others that you want to go on, and
No, just thank you for doing this and making it clear so that we know what to expect going into a project versus getting it on the conditions of approval. So I really appreciate that.
Thanks for your feedback. So Brendan, I think we'll end up staying on at least for another couple of minutes. If you wanted to mute and just turn our cameras off in case folks do join on past 7 o'clock, or folks who are in the room raise their hand, we can stay on and make sure we hear their feedback.
Sure.
We'll leave this on the screen. Okay, so to the city team, I think we'll, oh, looks like we have an attendee that just signed on. We'll give a few minutes to have that opportunity for the attendee to raise their hand if they wanted to speak. And I'll pull the slide back to the discussion questions. Okay, so again, to the city team, I think we'll wrap here. So again, thanks to everyone for listening and participating. So Brendan and my next step from here is to take the feedback and the questions and proceed with the amendments, which again, we're aiming for the July 17th city council meeting. If you have questions that you didn't get to ask here or feedback that you didn't get to share here, please feel free to reach out to myself or Brendan. Our contact info is here. So please reach out. Thanks, everyone.